And I think if we are taking winsomeness as a strategy, as the only strategy, if that's the end, not the truth, I think we'll fail to actually bring down or tear down these altars that culture has put up. And we got to fight that. Sometimes you have to do that, just as our master Christ has done, time and again throughout the scripture. If you read, and the disciples, I mean, they've not been winsome as we would understand today. That was not the end goal, but at the end, it was towards victory, which was to actually bring them to the light out of darkness.
Okay, everyone, welcome to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. I am joined today by three of our Kirkwood Center fellows, Dr. Jacob Daniel, right below me on the screen, Lenny Esposito, and Dr. Harry Edwards, two doctors in the house. But if you have a medical issue, do not call these gentlemen. They're not going to be able to help you with that kind of issue. But we have a Apologetics podcast today. It's actually more about method, I think, than anything else. We're going to be talking about maybe apologetical method or evangelism, really. And the topic for today's discussion is going to be winsome Christianity, or as it's put in one title of one book, Winsome Conviction. And this is kind of a general a term that applies to sort of an approach. I think it's an approach that some Christian thinkers, pastors, leaders have been promoting. And we want to take a closer look at what exactly people are saying as regards to this winsome approach of engaging with the culture we're living in. And also maybe look at whether or not it's a sufficient approach, or maybe it has some liabilities. There's been pushback, especially given the nature of the culture today and some of the battles that we're seeing unfold before us. So just to start off this discussion, I'm going to come to you, Harry, first. You wrote your dissertation on cultural apologetics and engaging the culture with Christian apologetics. What is your sense? What is your take on this idea of winsomeness in engaging with culture, in evangelizing, and in doing apologetics?
Yes, thanks, Anthony, for that question. I think for many years, when people hear Christian apologetics, it's always like trying to convince and persuade someone to get on their side, and they use primarily arguments like premise one, premise two, and if they're sound and they're true, then the conclusion that you arrive at definitely is solid. You cannot not believe its veracity, right? The problem with that today is that nobody, our younger generation, they don't care so much about truth. They make up their own truth, right? That you do you. That doesn't work today. We present them arguments, and they're just going to say, "Well, that doesn't work for me. It doesn't make me feel good." And so the discussion quickly ends, right? We think Christian apologetics is all about today just convincing them of the truth claims of Christianity. And that's all good. And for some, it'll work. But when you're dealing with a new generation that is biblically illiterate, like 96% of them are biblically illiterate, you got to find other ways. And those other ways are pretty much trying to build bridges. And what do I mean? What is that bridge? That bridge is something that you both can agree. Those are good starting points, like launch pads, which brings us to culture, right? I mean, and there are some values that are eternal. I think you can use those too, like meaning in life, purpose. You can start there too. But as you know, we at apologetics.com, right? We like to use some of the cultural artifacts to start our conversations, like AI, those kinds of what's AI doing in the world today? Can we derive truth from AI? How about identity? Those kinds of things. That's going on right now. And so you use those things, like the fact that we're politically divided as ever before since the Civil War. Those things are front and center of people's minds, even young people's minds. So use those. Those are bridges, and then slowly bring the gospel without using Christianese. You know what I mean? So that's, to me, that's winsome persuasion. And if I'm going to borrow from our dear friend Os Guinness, because I asked him, when does this stop? When do we stop engaging in this winsomeness? He actually said, never. You just keep talking about it. You do not disengage. You do not resort to all of the bad forms of argumentation, or physical violence, obviously, God forbid. But yeah, so I mean, I used to be an advocate of, although I vacillate between the whole culture warring and no culture warring. That language seems to be divisive, but I think, Tony, you might agree that maybe the church ought to start using a little bit of that language. So I'm comfortable with that whole culture war thing, but still be respectful, still be persuasive, still be winsome. But I'm not going to shy away now from culture war, the term culture war.
Yeah, that's good. That's okay. That's interesting because, I think there can maybe be a straw manning on either side. People who think that winsome Christianity is a problem, people who think that it's the way to go. One kind of straw man would say, like, well, winsome Christianity just means being nice to people, and nobody's advocating that we don't be nice to people, right? I mean, in a just very basic way. Now, there's a reality that some people, even many Christians, may just have rougher personalities than others. I don't know. I mean, everybody's different. And we can look through church history and see that, okay, this guy was maybe more of a personable, in his personality, and others were a little rough around the edges. If you've ever read any of St. Jerome's letters, you'll know what I mean. But it's more than just being nice or not trying to be mean to people, right? It's about finding these touch points or launch pads, this common ground, right, where we can start a discussion from the common ground, instead of starting it directly with like an appeal to Christianity, to classical arguments and evidence for the existence of God or the historical reliability of the Gospels or the resurrection of Jesus. So there's something in the culture that everybody's talking about, that everybody's concerned about. But then as we engage with people, especially young people, but not exclusively young people, about this, then we slowly fold in some of the truths of the gospel and how they might relate to those cultural touch points, right?
Right.
Is that a fair sort of summary?
That's fair. And I want to be clear that niceness or kindness is not to be maintained at all cost. That's always the goal. But and in our winsome speech, we can't control the reaction of people. So right, the gospel is a stumbling block to many, right, who don't believe. So I wouldn't advocate for smoothing out the truth claims of Christianity. We shouldn't back down. And if they're interpreted as mean, hateful, well, that's to be expected, right? But I'm not going to throttle down the truth claims of Christianity, or just the simple truth that we're all sinners and we need saving, right? Those kinds of things, especially what the Bible explicitly says is good and true, beautiful, and pursue those, and to not pursue those would be sin. So we still call sin. And obviously every Christian ought to be following 1 Peter 3:15, our favorite apologetics verse. We still now here's a good distinction. are Christians strictly to follow 1 Peter 3:15, meaning it's a defensive posture, or should we go on the attack sometimes? You know what I mean? That might be another episode here. But if we're just going to do 1 Peter 3:15, we're not backing down. We're on the, we're ready to give reason, right, for the hope that we have, and yet do it with gentleness and respect. So, no, you're right. We can't control people's reaction, and it's not being nice or winsome at all costs. Now, we're not going to get into Christian pacifism or whatever, right? But
yeah, well, we're not talking about like,
I mean.
if it just like a war breaks out, like a fit where there's and then people will have to choose whether or not to bear arms or not.
Right.
But what there could be different levels of aggressiveness in what we are defending. So Jacob, let me you've been having a lot of engagements recently. You've been getting invited to some political events. I think it was about 2 years ago, we had a couple engagements with some of the school boards, and for the sake of the audience, we're all in or around Orange County and LA County. So look, the cultural environment, especially in education right now, is at a tipping point. I mean, the pot is boiling over with regards to the kinds of, especially in the area of sexuality, the kind of sexual, I'll call it propaganda. I have no problem calling it propaganda. That's being forced into the schools by ideologues, all the way down to the kindergarten, so K through 12. So, I mean, let me pose this thought experiment. It's a thought experiment. I think is very close to reality, especially what we just saw in LA County yesterday, where the LGBTQ plus agenda got pushed into the schools. And, there's going to be not just Pride Month, but they're going to have an LGBTQ plus History Month, which is now going to be October. Then there's like 3 or 4 other LGBTQ holidays that are going to be taught every year, in K through 12 public schools in LA County. So, you're let's say you're a Christian couple living in LA County. You're just making ends meet because California is super expensive, right? You can't put your kids in a private Christian school. You don't have the capacity to homeschool them. You got, let's say, 2 young boys and a young girl. They have to go to an LA public school. And that 9 months out of the year, they're going to be getting indoctrinated. Now, you may hope that, we're going to correct that when they come home, and we're going to have discussions about the Bible, and we're certainly going to go to church every Sunday, and we got a good church. But at the same time, you're sitting there and that 9 months out of the year, they're going to have teachers, faculty, staff that in some way, shape, or form are going to be promoting an agenda that's absolutely antithetical to what you believe with regards to sexual ethics. I mean, so we put ourselves in that position. I mean, what's the approach there? How can we be winsome in that kind of environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. But I think let me take a step back, and we need to understand that the times in which we are living right now, the plausibility structures, as Peter Berger would put it, are different. We are not in a time where people really understand the common grounds. So over the past few decades, if you see, what we've been doing was we've been building the bridges, but we were the ones crossing to the other side. So we need to take that into consideration as well when it comes to engaging. So what I want us to emphasize is that the content of our apologetics remains the same, which is the gospel itself. But in terms of strategy, where we have come to today is that people are taking winsomeness as the only strategy to engage with people with the truth. And that's where the problem is. Convictions to be winsome, absolutely needed. That's how Scripture teaches us. So with regards to this scenario that you have put, so I would say this, as parents, there is no compromise that you can make with regards to the formation of your kids. That has to be the priority. You have to take that. And all other sacrifices should enable you to actually form them, even if that means that one of the parents would have to actually stay home and take care of the kids. You'll have to sacrifice, because what are you going to do in maybe 10 years when you have lost your kids already to the culture? there is no point shouting at the second crime. So when the first crime is done, shout loud. At the same time, take actions. You have to align with churches who have schools. You have to align with Christian community, which is able to come alongside you and support you. What about the co-op groups? I mean, come together, form groups of parents. If you don't have the resources to send them to a private school, how about parents coming together and helping each other? Because it's not an individual parent's issue. We are all breathing the same air. So I think parents have to come together and take responsibility towards their kids and teach them. So in that regard, so I'm not saying that you create a silo. That's not what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
I firmly believe that we need to be engaging with the public square. And that would sometimes mean that you may have to send them to a public school. Having said that, we're not sending our kids as missionaries. We need to know that we are the ones who need to be setting the agenda. So as parents, you got to put yourself in a place where you install faithful Christians in school boards. How about that? And because this, what we are seeing in our culture, is a byproduct of decades of efforts on the side of the left, right?
Right.
So if you're thinking that we can change that in a day, that's not going to happen. So we got to start slowly and now, so that in about 10 years from now, we would see some changes for the future generation. So that's where I would say, and not only that, maybe the churches have to take the responsibility now. Church leaders have to take responsibility and set up schools, set up curriculum, and take responsibility towards their congregants. And that's very much needed in our culture today.
Harry, Jacob made the point that we've been building bridges with the culture, but it seems like it's been a one-way crossing.
Right.
From the church to the culture, but not so much vice versa. Now, that might be hard to quantify, but it does seem to be generally the sense of things, right? We have a general sense that, if anything, the church is becoming more like the culture rather than vice versa. Now, that doesn't necessarily negate what you said about trying to build the bridges on on those cultural touch points. But I mean, would you say that we've gone even further now to the point of where at least building those bridges has become that much more difficult to do, at least in a successful way?
Well, you get farther away from the source. So part of my problem, I think part of the problem, I should say, with the idea and the concept is really the word winsomeness itself, because it's a word that's not used a lot outside of Christian circles. For example, we were, in our church, we do communion service. And I don't know if you guys have ever noticed this, but usually a person will get up before each of the elements, right? And they will normally say a prayer. And once they say a prayer, they say, okay, now let's partake. And I made the comment once, have you noticed that the word partake is only ever used at communion? Do you ever sit down at Thanksgiving and say, okay, now let's partake? It becomes a Christian word, and winsomeness becomes a Christian word that sometimes people start to fill with ideas of what that means. And really what we're talking about is approaching people with love. I mean, all winsomeness truly is not disparaging an individual, not degrading a person when you're discussing something with them, not treating them with disrespect, but you're trying to get the truth across in love. Sometimes, as you say, Tony, that takes a harder stance. Sometimes it takes a softer stance, much like a parent would try to correct their child. Now, in the past, Christianity and apologetics has approached correction almost like you would try to talk to your adult son or your adult daughter, right? Here are the reasons, here are the evidence. You have a good rational background. Here's what are you going to make of of these facts, and how are you going to make the right decision? But our society, unfortunately, has regressed because we are feelings based in our culture now. It's much more similar to talking to an elementary school child, perhaps, who may be obstinate, who may be petulant, and you are going to approach them somewhat differently in your engagement. You're not always going to say, no, because I said so. But sometimes you have to just say, that's wrong, full stop. And no, I don't buy what you're telling me,
Yeah. It's kind of the difference between engaging with sort of the, I don't know, maybe the who was the philosopher who became the deist? You guys know who I'm talking. Antony Flew.
Antony Flew.
It's like engaging with the Antony Flews in the 1990s, where you're dealing with an adult,
Right.
an older child for sure.
So-
or even a Richard Dawkins, and now it's more like you're dealing with like somebody who's been influenced by Robin DiAngelo.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a primary example. When I was at I take students onto Berkeley, right? And we'll do the Apologetics mission trip. And I was engaging with a woman at Berkeley, student there, who was helping a gentleman. He was campaigning for student vice president, ASB vice president there. And what we do is we have a series of questions on a sheet that we can approach people with and say, hey, we're taking a survey on morals and values. Would you like to answer this? Again, we're not threatening that way. It's disarming. So it's a disarming approach. Do you believe in God or a higher power? No, I don't believe in anything. It's Berkeley, right? Do you believe that there's an absolute right and wrong? No, I believe that morality is really subjective to the individual. And I said, well, wait a minute, I have a question for you. You're campaigning with this gentleman. I mean, there are other candidates running. It seems to me that you feel that his positions are better to such a degree that other people should then also support him. So why would you be campaigning for him if you don't hold to this view? Her response was, well, he's helped me move. He's done nice things for me, so I'm doing nice things for him. I said, yeah, but that doesn't seem to, you have to admit that there's at least some aspects of right and wrong. There's certain things that go beyond the purview. You have your sister standing beside you. What if one of these, folks who are indigent ran over, was schizophrenic, perhaps they're hearing voices in their head, and to them, the right thing to do was to grab your sister and rape her. Would you tell me that that is right because he actually believes it? He's sincere in his beliefs. And she said, well, yeah, I guess ultimately I couldn't say it was wrong for him to do that. Now her sister standing beside her takes a step back and looks over at her like,
she was being logically consistent.
And you know what? I looked in right in the eye and says, you're lying to me right now.
Yeah.
What you're trying to do is win an intellectual argument by abstracting this idea.
Right.
If this is real, if this guy's really coming at you and threatening you, you're screaming for the police.
Yeah.
So I don't buy it. So that to me is winsomeness. That to me is exactly what a parent would do with a child and say, no, it's easy to in the abstract dismiss this kind of stuff. Sometimes you've got to pull the rug out and say, let's talk about reality now, because people will tend to pull these into the abstraction. And I think it's more loving to call them on it than it is to let them continue in their delusion because you don't want to, quote unquote, insult them.
Lenny, to add to your point, I think we have to understand that our faith is iconoclastic. Culture is religion externalized, as Van Til put it. So everyone has installed some gods. And when you destroy those idols, it doesn't feel good sometimes, but you have to do that so that the scales fall off and they see the truth. And I think if we are taking winsomeness as a strategy, as the only strategy, if that's the end, not the truth, I think we'll fail to actually bring down or tear down these altars that culture has put up. Right. And we got to fight that. Sometimes you have to do that, just as our Master Christ has done, time and again throughout the scripture. If you read, and the disciples, they've not been winsome as we would understand today. That was not the end goal, but at the end, it was towards victory, which was to actually bring them to the light out of darkness.
So I was reading in the Sermon on the Mount today, and at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, If you who are evil know how to give good things to your children, will not your Father in heaven give good things to you? And in the commentary by Morris, he just highlights that Jesus assumes the evilness of men, right? I mean, it's not like he then gives an argument or anything. He just says, you who are evil. And I'm also teaching through Problem of Pain in church right now. And, in chapter 4, Problem of Pain, the Fall of Man, Lewis points out that this is the fundamental difference between ancient societies and modern society, right? So whereas when Paul was in Athens preaching to the pagan Greeks and Romans, they understood in a sense that the wrath of the gods was upon them. And they were looking for the solution to that. And he could give them the solution. But today, that's not the case. Today, the case is we have to preach the diagnosis because, and we've all read Carl Truman's great book on this as well. What's been mentioned here several times is feelings. And the general tendency is to rationalize in such a way that we feel good about ourselves. Right? We feel good about ourselves. And if we feel good about ourselves, although we might be depressed, but I'm talking about in the area of morality, right? We feel that we're morally justified. We feel that morally good. And I think this becomes maybe the crux of the issue is how to be winsome, but where you're in being winsome, you have to preach this diagnosis to a culture where people believe that they are good and are without any need for salvation from something like divine judgment. So Harry, let's come back to you.
Yeah. I like that.
And continue along like, because obviously we've all said we're not sacrificing truth in our winsomeness.
Yeah.
But the culture has shifted in such a way where our task is not easy.
Yeah. Well, let me just add to that. I mentioned that only 4% so that's 4 out of every 100 Gen Zers today. Those are folks born between 96 and 2015. Only 4 out of 100 grow up with a biblical worldview, according to Barna. That's crazy, right? So in some ways, if you're an evangelist, the harvest is right there before you. It's pretty easy. There's hardly any work, right? You're just picking up your harvest. In one sense, that's true, right? And so, if that is true, we ought to take advantage of that. And I have this method of, if I'm sharing the gospel to a non-believer today, I avoid using Christianese. So here's a good example. And Jacob's been with me on these couple CSU Fullerton, right? Cal State Fullerton trips. Yeah, outreach. I was talking to this young lady, and she's all tatted up with piercings everywhere, and so I don't hang around this kind of group. I have no idea about her story, but we had a good chat. And you mentioned diagnoses, right? So I was just casually chatting with her, telling her about the human condition, and she was paying attention very closely. Remember, I'm not preaching. I'm not trying to sell anything. I did start with a human condition, and she was definitely very engaged. You could tell. So that's part of the diagnoses, right? And then I told her the hope that we have in Jesus. Again, avoiding Christianese language. And at the very end, she just looked up at me and she said, "That's really great news. That's awesome news." I didn't say good news. I didn't say gospel. I didn't say anything. So it's like a eureka moment for her. She pretty much persuaded herself to think about these things. And I love the outcome of that. And I hope and pray that, that was a seed planted. But let's go back to the bridges part. because I like that analogy. We ought to be building bridges. But as Dr. Daniel said, it seems like we're the ones traversing the bridge, going over their side, not the other way around. Well, maybe have we considered as bridge builders that perhaps the bridge we're building doesn't look stable, it doesn't look safe, it doesn't look inviting? Maybe the bridge going over to our side doesn't look beautiful. Maybe it's threatening. We ought to consider that.
Yeah.
And who's building the bridge? We ought to consider that too. Who's building the bridge? Who's leading it? As we know, as Os Guinness points out a lot, what's lacking right now in Christendom is good church leadership. Now, he himself, I consider an evangelical leader, but he sees nobody on the horizon to lead, evangelicals to the next generation. So who's leading it? Maybe no one right now. We're also divided as a church, right? Mm-hmm. So going back to the bridge thing, or what's the bridge made out of too, right? What's the content of that bridge? Mm-hmm. So if you ask me again, I think the church is failing in this area. Yes, we can blame modernity, secularity, all of those things. But I think it's the church that allows those things to happen. So again, you guys are my friends. You've heard me say this. I do blame the church on this. The rise and fall of good culture depends on the church. It's not that the enemy plays tricks on us or surprises us or that we're weaker. No, we just sit back. We just refuse to engage, and that's what happens. And that could be, again, lack of engineering in our bridge building, right? Nobody's building bridges anymore. So
I think there's a little bit of point where the church starts to go acquiesce to the culture. And that's part of it, where again, we don't want to, don't preach those hellfire and brimstone sermons. Or so part of that problem stems from the idea of what we talked about before, being different, being committed to Christ is so different that it may be uncomfortable. It's so anti-cultural that it makes people, even in the church, not certain whether they want to go there. I mean, right. And that becomes, enigmatic of the problem. So as Jacob said, when the moral values shift, then what happens is you get a new Overton window, right? And the left is now defined as something even more radical than it was, but conservatism is also defined something more progressive than it used to be, and then that becomes the new norm until there's another shift, and it always goes the one direction. So that becomes a problem. I
would add this one more aspect too. I mean, we have to look at culture in a broader sense. What we need to do, and Tony, you and Dr. Edward was talking about diagnosis. I think we should be diagnosing the presuppositions of culture. So much needed, even when we are attempting to actually build those bridges or connection with people. And you touched on that, Tony, and one of the presuppositions or clear presuppositions of a culture is the whole idea of looking within, the psychological self. And what it seeks for is the whole idea of affirmation. And whole of our culture, including our social media, caters to that need that people have to be affirmed. So when we go with this attitude of winsomeness, and we end with that without offering the solution, the surgery that is needed to the culture, if we are not doing that, what we are doing is actually affirming what they're hoping to be affirmed. And I think that's where the danger is. So what we need to be doing is that diagnosis. At the same time, we should be able to actually provide the needed surgery that would bring about a resolution, which is the circumcision of their heart.
Yeah, okay. A couple things that you and Lenny just said that, I mean, here's something that I was thinking about earlier with regards to the question of winsomeness. And it's something that I've experienced more as an evangelical than as growing up Roman Catholic. I don't know that this is as pronounced an issue in Roman Catholicism as in the evangelical church, at least the evangelical church in America. But I do feel sometimes that perhaps the winsomeness approach, almost as if it places too big of a sort of spiritual and moral gap between the believer in Jesus and the non-believer. Right? Where it's like the non-believer almost can do, unless they become a Christian, born again, on fire for the Lord, we shouldn't expect much of any kind of moral compass or, moral goodness from the non-believer, as if we couldn't live in a better culture, a better secular culture, as opposed to a worse secular culture. Like, it's like, so, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, is there a way for the church to be active and engaged with the culture, trying to maintain a moral and just society without thinking we have to convert every single person to Jesus in order to live in a better society than a worse one? You know what I mean? Because it's getting to that point, and we'll do another episode on Christian nationalism specifically, but it's getting to that point where, what is the role of the church? Maybe it's more of a prophetic role, where it's saying this as a culture, as a civilization, regardless of whether person X, Y, or Z becomes a follower of Jesus, civilizationally, things just can't continue this way. Right? So where you're warning everybody for the sake of everybody. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Like, and sometimes that might have to, that kind of warning at the civilizational level, might look a little aggressive. And it might not even explicitly state the gospel, although you'd want to do both. Obviously, you still are primarily here to, the church is still primarily here to win souls at the end of the day.
Let me chime in on that one, Anthony. So again, if we're gonna accept the premise that civilizations rise and fall on churches, if we are to save civilization, and you're a secularist, and we want a better society, no, we don't say that everyone must be a Christian in order for that to happen. However, closely related to that, as a culture, or as governments, as a society, as members of those, as they follow God's will, the good result would be a better society. That's just how it's going to happen. But you don't aim for a better society without first being grounded in Christianity. So again, right? We know Rodney Stark and his writings and his findings on how Christianity flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They were just doing God's work. In fact, history showed that it's not like people were engaging in politics or argumentation, or although all of those things are part of the deal, but for the most part, society improved because we were just doing the right thing, like saving babies from trash heaps and taking care of the sick, the widows, all of those things, basic things that everyone can do. So like now, let's go back many centuries later. Today, I feel like Christian parents, they've abandoned some of those basic things in the home. Maybe they're not teaching their kids scripture. They're not instilling in them disciplines like going to church or attending youth group. Just those kinds of things. I think we've sort of abandoned those kinds of things because of, diversions, right? As Pascal would put it, we have so many diversions.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
to address your question there, yeah, for sure. We don't have to be a Christian nation in order to have a good society. Although it will become, in a way, a Christian nation if Christians just do their thing. They just do Christian things.
So I think one of the ways we're seeing this even today is in the pushback against the transgender movement. So think about some of the voices that you're seeing, even Christians follow right now. James Lindsay, James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, their whole shtick up until say 2015 was to go on college campuses and debate Christians on the ridiculousness of the Christian faith, until they started looking around, seeing how everybody's canceling them, and just go, you know what? The only people who actually care about logic and reason and evidence and debate are the Christians. And this new movement, where first it was cancel culture and then more recently the whole transgenderism, they said this is a bigger issue because this will actually take out all of civilization. And you even have pro-LGBT groups like Gays Against Groomers who are coming out against the whole thing as well. If you have feminists coming out against it, so you're starting to see a lot of individuals going, this is existentially dangerous. It's really threatening our existence. And that's, I think, a pretty good measure or an example of what we're talking about, where we can at least put on this issue, push forward. And then we go further.
Right.
And like Harry, interesting. One of the things that Stark says that made a difference was the plague of Galen in AD 165. So this is like one of the first major plagues, probably a bubonic plague, basically decimated the Roman army. At least 9 out of 10 soldiers were, but it was so severe that Roman citizens were packing up and fleeing the city and leaving to the country. But it was the Christians who they were passing. Christians were walking in as the Romans were walking out. And Stark believes that because the Christians were there, many of them died. They caught the plague and they died by nursing other people to help. But because they were doing that work, those that survived and their patients that survived not only became more resilient, right, strengthened against plague, but they became more pro-Christian. So, hey, Uncle Lucius says, you guys all left me. The Christians were the ones who saved me. They were the ones who gave me food and mopped my brow. And Christianity had an explosion at the end of the second century.
Lenny, that brings up some a kind of issue that did crop up during COVID, as we were trying to respond to
exactly
COVID as a church,
and AIDS before it.
And one of the points that the Tom Holland, the author, not the actor, made was, but so many of the kinds of things that Christians did in the ancient world with what we would call, concrete acts of charity, health,
medicine,
outreach, have just been assumed by the state. That's just what the state does.
Yes. And that's
the church
huge
sort of
problem.
sits by and kind of like, what's our role? Because we have all of the state functionaries and institutions that have been grounded in a Christian, at least a Christian anthropology, right? Of seeing the dignity of the individual. And so, but I mean, that, and we could do another thing on that, but then the church kind of sits back and says, okay, now what? This has sort of been outsourced to the state.
Yeah, but they don't need to do that. They've abdicated that. And here's an example. Right. Pick any natural disaster. Who are the first two organizations on scene at any natural disaster? It's the Salvation Army and it's the American or the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, both Christian organizations. And why are they there when governments have extensive networks? Because government can't move that fast.
Mm-hmm. And not only that, Lenny, the universal nature of that, when a Christian organization goes, it doesn't ask whether you're a Christian or not, right? Tell me about one Hindu aid agency. Tell me about one Muslim aid agency that reaches out to people of other faith.
Yeah, well, there's the Red Crescent, who was basically a spinoff on the Red Cross. But even Doctors Without Borders, was a secular spinoff of the Red Cross. It was a Christian organization who inspired those, and there's a few secularists who said, okay, I don't necessarily want to use the religious litmus test. But even in southern Turkey, when where it's all Muslim, it was Christians who are moving in and providing their support. And we could do the same thing with COVID. We choose not to. The Christian understanding of love is so unique and really, I don't know how people really understand the depth of it. I mean, the one I point to is the scripture in where Paul says, if you find a thief, you have to teach him not to steal. Instead of letting him steal, train him to get a job, not so he can become a productive citizen. No, they say, train him to get a job. Paul literally says this, so that when he makes money, he can give it to the poor. That's the level. It's like whatever I have, you have. Mm-hmm. It's self-sacrifice to that degree. And C.S. Lewis, when they were
without that being compelled by the state, you have to do it
without it being love can never
Yeah.
be compulsion. Exactly. Yeah. And that's the problem. So that's the issue. You can't rely on the state. It's got to be separately. And Lewis was asked about the tithing question. Do I tithe 10%? Do I tithe, what's the appropriate portion of my income one should tithe to be a faithful Christian? And Lewis, I thought, gave the perfect answer. You should tithe always just a little bit more than is comfortable. It should cause you a little bit of pain. And if you're pushing your money out so that you have to maybe not get the latte, it's the thing that you'd want to do but you can't. That's usually where the proper amount falls.
Yeah, and I think this could be a topic for another episode, maybe. But the difference is our understanding of what dignity is, what an individual is, being made in the image of God. And I think that very idea has transformed the constitutions of nations, including here in America, that we all are created equal, right? And I think that's what informs the Christian generosity that is experienced by people around the world, including nations.
Well, and that, Jacob, that does hit something at a little bit deeper level, because and again, I'll reference Tom Holland. Although I've not read his book, Dominion, I've heard him lecture on it several times, where he does make this good point of like, there's a sort of like an explicit rejection of Christianity, but without a recognition of the deep roots that the culture has in Christianity and how that is informing everybody as they live, move, and have their being in the culture. Strip away those assumptions, and perhaps all of a sudden Christianity will look attractive to people again, because they've forgotten the how the culture has been shaped in a certain direction because of Christianity. Where if we're all living in I put this point before, if we're all living in the ancient Roman world, a group like, or even in the Islamic world today, a group like Black Lives Matter would never get off the ground. They'd have no chance of doing what they did, or certainly not making the money that they did either.
Hey, you got to mention, Tony, that Tom Holland's not even a believer.
Yeah.
Well, I think he is now. Actually, I don't know. I mean, we'll keep it, because last interview I saw, he was talking about how he's going to church with his wife, and so I don't know. But
in this topic of winsomeness, I think one thing that would really help us is that to understand that this is how I put it. Just like the idea of justice and meaning, those are kind of like transcendent longings that God has put in our hearts. I think there's a longing for dignity in every culture among all people. What they don't have is a foundation that will allow for the dignity, intrinsic dignity and worth of all individuals. And as people who've been made in the image of God, and we've been given the privilege of seeing the work of Christ in our lives, I think that's what we need to be offering. And that sometimes would happen in a way that would not be easily accepted, because it is not having ramifications or consequences in the life of the individual, but it also actually has consequences in the life of the nation itself. And that is seen as threatening. And that's what's happening around the world today. If you look at a nation like India, its wanting to reject its constitution, which is built on the biblical idea of dignity of all individuals. So there's a fight, internal fight going on to remove that constitution and bring in a new understanding based on duties only, not rights.
Well, Jacob, I think the idea of dignity as it relates to the individual, I think that is the central focus of our Winsome Apologetics, Winsome Evangelism right now. Because, I mean, most philosophers of history and historical theologians will say the shift over the last few hundred years has been towards the person. Philosophical anthropology, theological anthropology is at the fore. What we are, who we are, we're at the apex of that question now. And people are maybe less interested in what is that, with like a outward pointing thing. And so I'd say from a theological perspective, it's theological anthropology that is at the center of everything right now. How to address the idea of personhood, dignity, sanctity of life. And, this is where I always tell my students, like, when we're dealing with individuals, regardless of whether, they have no hair or blue hair or multicolored hair or however many peers, you're dealing with the dignity of an image bearer of God. But then I'll say, but when you were dealing with ideologies of what societies believe or what is propagated as an idea, a model for reality or truth, I think that's where the Christian can be tenacious, where we're not taking into account a particular person. We're going ruthlessly after an ideology that we know to be destructive to persons. That's why we're going after it. So as long as we can maintain the distinction between when dealing with an individual that is that image bearer of God, who may have fallen for an ideology, right? Ideas affect beliefs, beliefs affect, our beliefs about ourselves and what we are and how we function in the world. But keep that distinction. Let me shift the discussion to go a little bit different route here with regards to ideology, though, because we are up against these very aggressive ideologies. I feel like there could be a kind of winsome Christianity, and I think maybe this is a critique some of us have levied against certain people who promote that idea, not in the way that Harry was outlining it for us, per se. That is this sort of like, let's build a bridge and then we'll cross over that bridge, right? That something like that is going on, where we have to be relevant to the culture in such a way that we are capitulating to an ideology, right? And I think that's the concern. And one of the things that I think the church needs to be aware of is how propaganda has been developed over time specifically to aim at Christianity and Christians and the church. I mean, there's a long history going back into the Soviet Union of how to leverage Christianity against itself so as to, especially the Christian moral law, the law of God, in order to gain political traction and achieve a political agenda. And this is being done in spades. It goes under the guise of social justice, critical theory, so on and so forth. And, one of the books that we would recommend, Saul Alinsky's old book, Rules for Radicals. And when he goes, tactic number 4, and I'll just read it because I think this is relevant. Tactic number 4, he says this explicitly in the 1960s. Make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. You can kill them with this, for they can no more obey their own rules than the Christian church can live up to Christianity. And then he says the 4th rule carries within it a 5th rule. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. So one dynamic I think we got to say that is at play, at least, when we're trying to be winsome to the culture in the right way is that a large portion of the culture knows exactly how to play the dynamic of Christian guilt and shame and hold us up to what ultimately is an impossible standard, right? The moral law of God. That's why we need Christ. That's why we need grace. That's why we need the cross. That's why we need the sanctifying power of the Holy Spirit. We can't live up to that law, moral law on our own. But that this is explicitly leveraged in the culture against us, so as to make us feel like we're not in a position to really proclaim the truth. Because after all, aren't we all just guilty sinners? And aren't we all, in a sense, really filled with hate and so on and so forth? So I think we got to be careful, because Jesus tells us to be gentle as doves, but also wise as serpents. And I think a lot of very well-meaning pastors, church leaders, if they're not discerning how propaganda works and how the language works and how there's an explicit attack that leverages Christian moral sensibilities in order to gain political wins and victories, if they're not aware of that, there can be sort of a handing over and a sort of a capitulation to the spirit of the age. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Tony, on that. You hit the head on the nail on the head. That's the reason why I think, again, we go back to the church. It's impotent now because of all of the hypocrisy that's been pointed out, So maybe in some ways we need to clean house. In some ways, maybe we need a better PR person. Now, obviously, God forgives all and grace abounds. We know that. And we wish and pray that our church realizes that, and that somehow, even though we fail, that hopefully that's not discouraging to the point that we're continuing in this impotence. You know what I mean? But it starts from there again. If we somehow know our identity in Christ again, maybe that needs to be preached more, then perhaps we're freer to act in the world. We can be better ambassadors, so to speak. So, but yeah, maybe there needs to be a process. Maybe God during this time is teaching us to be humble, to repent, to seek courage and accept courage, and again, remind us of who we are, prince and princesses of the King. Then perhaps that would motivate us to do good in the world again. Yeah.
There's an interesting letter when Tertullian was writing the Emperor, talking about how the persecution of Christianity was actually detrimental to Rome. He was making a point. One of the points that he was making is, he said, that the Christians aren't bad citizens. In fact, they're better citizens than any other group. So why would you want to persecute them? He goes, and I can prove that you know it, because you take our women and you don't throw them to the lions. You'd rather turn them into temple prostitutes, because you recognize that for those women, death is something better in their eyes than being morally violated and besmirched. And that's an amazing statement. And he actually makes a pun of it, Leon versus Leo in Latin. But he was pointing out that you yourselves know that we are a moral people, because you want to force us into immorality, thinking that's the worst punishment you can give us. Do we see that in the church today, that people are so morally driven that there are values that supersede safety, supersede comfort, that we would rather give all of that up, even to the point of death, perhaps, instead of having our moral continence violated? That's, again, and a lot of this is I'm not saying that the churches have been completely negligent in this. But they have, as the Overton window has shifted, and we've become more individualistic, and we've become more placid because it's easy to live the good life, right? We live in the conceit of affluence. We, as you said at the beginning, we don't worry about that our lives are hanging on a precipice and we could be smitten down at any time.
Yeah. You should have seen the breakfast I had at IHOP this morning.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, it's true. The complacency aspect's true. And I felt it most poignantly the week I got back from Afghanistan, after spending half a year in Afghanistan, part of the time where we living off of Otis Spunkmeyer muffins and beef jerky for like 3 weeks because we didn't have ground transport into the COP I was on. Everything had been flown in by helicopter, which was quite dangerous because the Taliban had RPGs. And then I got back to North Carolina and I walked into a Whole Foods and I literally almost vomited. I was disgusted. I actually had to grab my wife and leave because I could not stand in this Whole Foods supermarket and see the sheer abundance and variety of foodstuffs. And it was like, I was like, there's a great scene, little tangent here. It's probably the only good scene in the whole movie, The Hurt Locker.
That's a great movie.
It won the Academy. Well, it's hard for anybody who's been in the Army to watch that movie with a serious face because there's so many errors in it. But the one scene that's terribly accurate is way at the end, where he comes home on leave and he's an EOD sergeant. He defuses bombs for a living, and he's standing in the grocery store.
Oh yeah,
and he's faced with this wall of breakfast cereals. And he doesn't know what to do. And like, it's just this long 10-second scene. And he like grabs a box of cereal and he just, anyways. So there is this, I mean, certainly there's this sense of our lives are not on a precipice. At least I don't feel that.
Yeah.
But that's only in the physical sense, right? That's only in the physical sense. And the because we're not physically in the dire straits, we can start to believe that we're not spiritually and mentally in the dire straits.
That was, and I pointed this out to my students last week. That was the best line in the movie The Matrix, where Smith is talking to Morpheus and he says, our first creation of the Matrix was a paradise, was a perfect world, and you guys didn't thrive at all. You languished. It's very much Wall-E. It's you sit around and you become fat and lazy and you don't push yourself forward. It's only in the face of adversity. And it's an interesting secondary response to the problem of evil question as well. Without adversity, what would happen? I mean, Tertullian again, right? The blood of the church is seed. That's when the explosions happen, when the martyrdoms happen. Are we ready for that? Is the church ready for that? I don't know.
Well, and
also I think I think we should also look at this one aspect, regardless of, whatever culture you are in, with different worldviews, they have very optimistic eschatology. And here we are talking about winsomeness with a very pessimistic future, right, in mind. I don't think we're going to work with that. We have the victory in Christ. What we need is a confidence about what's been accomplished because of Christ, right, around the world in different cultures, and the evil that we have fought time and again and won over, and have, even in our generation today, we're talking about abortion or even the gender issues. Who is really fighting to save lives?
Yeah.
Christians
well,
are.
I think the analogy, that's the right analogy to the Christians who are going into the cities in Rome to save people, is who is trying to save the unborn. I think that's the contemporary analogy that fits best with the Christians in the 3rd century or the 2nd century during the bubonic plague that hit the Roman Empire.
Yeah. So
and that's where also you're getting the greatest resistance as well.
If we are truly to win the culture, we need to be also learning how to amplify, I believe. I think that's the task that the church has, to teach its congregants what did Christianity do for the whole culture around the world, for nations around the world. We need to be amplifying that as well while we are advocating and what the gospel to the culture, trying to baptize it with the truth. We need to also amplify what we have done I think that confidence has to be brought back.
Abolition was a Christian movement through and
I was
through.
just
There's and nobody talks about that. You can't divorce abolition from Christianity.
Yes.
Well, and that brings up us to a more pedagogical point, that in our apologetics, we just had the podcast with James Ungurianu that we'll post up in a couple weeks. And we need, a part of our apologetics is not having a whitewashed, crystalline version of church history, but at least having an accurate version of church history, where not all evils in the world lead back to the church, right? Although many would like to paint it that way. It used to be the new atheists. Now it's a different group, perhaps, than the new atheists. But the projection of all evil onto the church is also sort of part of our defensive apologetics, where, like, again, and going back to Tom Holland and even others who are not Christians, like Douglas Murray, defending the church and Christendom. I mean, we can at least defend it for the good things that, the very good things that Christianity spread throughout the globe. Now, there may be an explicit rejection of those things, fine and good. But that's part of exposing, I think, the foundations that people are assuming to be the case, when no, they don't. They don't have to be that way. The culture could be very different, right? Well, let's go around the horn and we'll wrap this one up. Just some final thoughts. Harry, we'll start with you since we kicked it off with you. Go ahead. Where are we with Winsome Christianity after this discussion?
Yeah, I know. Great discussion so far, gentlemen. We have to remember that the true revolutionaries were actually Christians, right? In the church in Thessalonica, I remember the people were saying, "You've invited these guys here again, the people who've turned the world upside down," right? They're referring to the disciples. So how do we do that? How do we turn the world right side up again? Because it is upside down in bad ways. We need to turn it right side up, and we are the true revolutionaries. So how do we do it with winsomeness? Yeah.
Lenny?
Yeah, I would say
or Jacob,
we need
I guess.
to do all that is necessary to recover our prophetic voice in culture. If we have capitulated, not if, but we have capitulated to the culture in many ways, we have to recover our prophetic voice, conscience, and imagination. That has to happen. And we need to know that Christ is interested in culture. And it's not that the culture is going to redeem us, but the culture needs redeeming. And only Christ can do that. And I think we have much to provide as an evidence, even in the past, that Christ has done that and have set people free. And that's the confidence we need to be working with.
One of the things that I think that we need to remember, and I agree we need to reach out, but Christianity is a package deal. It is a complete worldview, and all aspects of it have to be taken as a whole. So when we talk about things like the rise of Western science that allows us to extend lifespans, grow more crops, create medicines, when we talk about anti-slavery movements in the 1800s, anti-eugenics movements in the early 1900s, and anti-trans movements in the 2000s, those all have their basis within Christianity. Christianity has a moral yardstick, a golden yardstick, that is foundational to, and it comes from the teachings of Christianity. For the enemies of Christ to take that yardstick and then beat Christians over the head with it. You're not loving enough. You're not being kind. You got to say, well, wait a minute. You can't use my yardstick. Where are you getting these ideas from? And that's the problem. So as you're saying, remind the culture. Stephen, when faced with the Sanhedrin, wasn't winsome in the sense that maybe we customarily understand. I mean, your blood of the blood, which people have you not killed? Paul calling on the Galatians, who has bewitched you? It's that let those people be anathema. He uses strong language for strong dangers, but he still calls them brothers and sisters and saints in the Lord. I mean, he called the Corinthian church saints in the Lord, and look at the sins that they were involved in. So I think it's a both and. I think we have to approach it in a both and aspect. And then just remember that there are these borrowed meanings, these borrowed values that we can say, hey, that if you like that value, that's a Christian value, and it comes with a whole set of others.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'll just say for my piece, I mean, I was reading again Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7, and you know, the golden rule in Matthew's gospel, which is slightly different than the form of the golden rule that's found like in Confucius or other religions, is the positive rule.
Yeah.
Do unto others.
Do unto others. Do good things unto others as you would want them to do good things unto you. It's not just don't harm people or leave them alone. So when Jesus ups the ante, he ups the ante. I mean, we are commanded to do good to others, not just to refrain from doing evil to them. Right? And that, I think, refraining from doing evil is always easier than figuring out ways to do good to people. And one of the things I think we can never stop doing is, as crazy as the culture might seem to get, is to stop trying to do good to people, even if they don't perceive it as good. And what that assumes is that we are biblically and spiritually grounded enough to know what evil is. And then to Harry's point, the church needs to resist evil in its own walls. If we can't clean house to some degree, we know, I mean, we're a hospital, it's triad, we understand that. But there's got to always be an introspection, a removal of the board before we look at the speck, and a resisting of evil in our own lives. And I think we could say that within the church, it's not looking great right now. The culture's infected us to a point where the bridge does look a little shaky to cross over, even though we know that the bridge is Christ, and it's not. It's perceived that way. So, all right, gentlemen, great discussion. We're going to do it again soon. So thank you guys for joining, and yeah, we'll see you next time.